Warning: this is a true crime and horror genre channel and is not for the faint of heart, minor-aged individuals, or the easily impressionable. This video will contain details that some viewers may find highly disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. You have been warned.
Hello, my most beloved in Murder's Horde. Welcome back. I am, of course, your mistress of murder, Sam Kempo, and of course, you all have met my little companion, Charlie. Say hello, Charlie. Today, my most valued band of bloodthirsty mortals, I've decided to take you on a very different kind of adventure. Now, a while back, I expressed the desire to expand my subject matter to include some of the more gorier aspects of my first love, that being psychology. And truly, my horde, it does get highly disturbing of the things that great minds of this field were capable of when curiosity, ambition, and the prospect of new discoveries were involved. As I have often said, the film on the screen is always more interesting, at least until the projector breaks. And, as a studier and former practitioner in the field, I must say there is something incredibly addicting to discovering what makes the human psyche tick, or, in some cases, stop ticking. Let us begin. You know the drill by now, my lovelies. Pick your poison. Sit back, relax, and let's have ourselves a little conversation. When it comes to experimentation, be it for scientific research or medical research or even in psychological research, humanity often pays a high price for progress and understanding. At least, that seems to be the case in many famous or infamous psychological experiments. Now, while I will say that a lot of these are highly unethical, they did serve a greater purpose for this relatively young field, as the actual field of psychology is only a few centuries old. Now, I know that may not seem very young to most of you, but when you consider that medicine and even scientific research has been practiced all the way back to ancient Egyptian and ancient Greek and Roman times, psychology is a relatively new field. Our first psychological ethical blunder is one that I actually was unfamiliar with until I did the research for this video. It is called the Three Christs of Yspelunte. Now, this is neither a Shakespearean play or a Bible-themed vigilante hit squad. It's actually the brainchild of a Dr. Milton Rockek, who thought it would be quite a bit of fun to put three mentally ill people in a hospital together, all three of whom had the same unwavering delusion that they were, in fact, the Jesus Christ reincarnate. Now, the theory was that if each man could understand that the other two were clearly fantasies, then he might then begin to question his own beliefs for the same reasons. After all, how could there be three? Now, one would think that this might actually work, at least in theory or on paper. However, this study lasted an outstanding amount of time. Actually, it lasted about 2 years. In the end of it, all three patients stuck to their guns and never once wavered from their belief that they were the one and only Jesus incarnate, though despite their cohabitants' claims to the contrary. Now, initially, the men simply argued over who was the true Messiah and struggled to find a compromise. Eventually, the disagreements descended into physical fights, but it finally became a uneasy stalemate, In short, each man discounted the other two as being delusional psychiatric patients or mindless robotic corpses that were being controlled by machinery. To put it simply, there was only one Jesus, and they all remained stalwart in the belief that they, and they alone, were the real deal. A very interesting find, I will have to admit. Though this is not the worst that I've read. In fact, this one is rather tame. The ones I'm about to tell you about are by far much worse. The animal drug addiction experiments. Now, this was happening in about the late 1980s when neuroscientists were conducting literally hundreds of rather disconcerting addiction experiments on monkeys and rats. Now, the common practice involved teaching the animals to self-administer drugs, and it was typically cocaine that was being used. This is actually quite possible. In fact, there's even a psychologist that I may do on a later date who actually trained pigeons how to bowl. In fact, I will link the video of that in the description below. But it was using a lever, and that resulted in a lot of disturbing addicted behaviors in the animals. Now, in some studies, the drug lever eventually offered access to alternatives from the drug, such as food, water, or even mates. However, the drug-addicted monkeys opted for a fix of the cocaine every single time until they literally starved themselves to death. Now, addicted lab rats would even walk across electrified grids in order to get a dose of the drug, and were willing to withstand a much higher voltage to access the drug than to reach their own food. Worst of all is that the findings of these rather cruel case studies are probably completely invalid, as a 1980 paper shows that these behaviors only occurred in the rats that were kept in a small laboratory cage. Now, rats that were raised in a special enclosure that contained a lot of food, hamster wheels, mates, and possibly other things, who were then force-fed water-laced opioids for about 2 months, still retained a preference for plain water as soon as it was made available to them. Now, in contrast, the rats who had lived in the jail-like cages their entire lives became heroin or cocaine addicts at the drop of a hat. Now, this is very interesting. Unfortunately, the same study was not done for the monkeys. Now we have reached the most infamous on this list, though it is not our last, not by far. It is known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. Now, this study is not necessarily unethical, but its results were disastrous nevertheless. Its sheer infamy puts it on this list. Now, famed psychologist Philip Zimbardo led this experiment to examine the behaviors of individuals when placed into roles of either prisoner or guard, and the norms the individuals were expected to display. Now, prisoners were put into a situation purposely meant to cause disorientation, degradation, and depersonalization. Guards were not given any specific directions or training on how to carry out their roles, though at first the students who participated in the study were confused and unsure of how to carry out their roles. Eventually, they had no problem. The second day of the experiment invited a rebellion by the prisoners, which brought a severe response from the guards. Things only went downhill from there. Guards implemented a privilege system meant to break the solidarity between prisoners and create distrust between them. The guards became paranoid about the prisoners, believing that they were out to get them. This caused the privilege system to be controlled in every aspect, even in the prisoners' bodily functions. Prisoners began to experience emotional disturbances, depression, and learned helplessness. During this time, prisoners were visited by a prison chaplain. They identified themselves by numbers rather than their names. and when asked how they planned to leave the prison, most prisoners reacted very confused. They had, in a very short span of time, completely assimilated into their roles. Now, Dr. Zimbardo ended the experiment after just 5 days, when he realized just how real the prison had become to the subjects. Though the experiment only lasted a short time, the results are very telling. How quickly someone can abuse their control when put into the right circumstances, and how quickly one can assimilate to an abusive situation. Our next psychological blunder is one that even disturbed me. It is known as the Aversion Project, and this happened during the 70s and 80s. Now, South Africa's apartheid army forced white, lesbian, and gay soldiers to undergo a sex change in the 1970s and 1980s, and submitted many to chemical castration, electric shock, and other unethical medical experimentations. Although the exact number is not known, former apartheid army surgeons estimate that as many as 900 were forced to have sexual reassignment operations that may have been performed between 71 and 89 at military hospitals as part of a top-secret program to root out homosexuality from the service. Now, Army physicians aided the chaplains aggressively ferreting out suspected homosexuals from the armed forces, sending them to military psychiatric units, chiefly Ward 22 of one military hospital near Pretoria. Those who could not be cured with drugs, aversion shock therapy, hormone treatment, and other radical psychiatrics, and I use that term loosely, means, were chemically castrated or given sex change operations. Although several cases of lesbian soldiers abused have been documented so far, including one botched sex change operation, most of the victims appear to have been very young, between the ages of 16 to 24-year-old white males drafted into the Army at the time. Now, Dr. Aubrey Levin, who was the head of the study, is now somehow a clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatric Forensics Division at the University of Calgary's Medical School. He is also in private practice as a member in good standing at the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta. Our next psychological blunder is one that is quite infamous in the psychological circles. It was conducted in 1939 and is known only as the Monster Study. Now, the Monster Study was a stuttering experiment done on 22 orphan children in Davenport, Iowa, conducted by Wendell Johnson at the University of Iowa. Now, Johnson actually didn't conduct this experiment himself. He chose one of his graduate students, Mary Tudor, to conduct the experiment, and he supervised her research. Now, after placing the children in control and experimental groups, Tudor gave positive speech therapy to half of the children, praising their fluency in speech, and negative speech therapy to the other half, belittling the children for every speech imperfection and telling them that they were stutterers even if they weren't. Many of the normal-speaking orphan children who received the negative therapy in the experiment suffered negative psychological effects. Some retained speech problems during the course of their life well into adulthood. Now, it was dubbed the Monster Study by most because of how badly it affected those who received the negative therapy. Now, what I mean by that is the fact that some of the children actually stopped speaking altogether. They became so paranoid that they refused to speak. Those who received the positive therapy, on the other hand, for those who did stutter, actually lost their stutter after a while, or it became less noticeable. It was also dubbed the monster study by some of Johnson's peers, who were horrified to learn that he would experiment on orphan children just to prove a theory. Now, the experiment was actually kept hidden for fear of Johnson's reputation being tarnished in the wake of the human experiments conducted by the Nazis during World War II. The University of Iowa actually publicly apologized for the monster study in 2001. Our next psychological blunder of all time is one that is actually quite sad and was not intentionally a psychological failure. Now, it is known as the Little Albert experiment, and this occurred in about 1920. Now, John Watson, who is the father of behavioralism in psychology, was a psychologist who was apt to using orphans in his experiment. Now, at the time, this was not uncommon. Watson wanted to test the idea of whether fear was innate or was a conditioned response. Now, Little Albert was the nickname given to the 9-month-old infant that Watson chose from the hospital and was exposed to a white rabbit, a white rat, a white monkey, mask with and without hair, cotton wool, burning newspaper, and just a menagerie of many different other things to elicit a response. Now, this was going on for about 2 months, and this is without any sort of conditioning. Now, the experiment began by placing Albert on a mattress in the middle of a room, and a white, fake laboratory rat was placed near Albert, and he was allowed to play with it. At this point, the child showed no fear of the rat. Then Watson would make a loud sound behind Albert's back by striking a suspended steel bar with a hammer whenever the baby touched the rat. On these occasions, little Albert cried and showed fear as he heard the noise being upsetting. After this was done several times, Albert became very distressed whenever the rat was displayed. Soon after, Albert had associated the white rat with the loud noise and was producing the fearful or emotional response of crying. It was then discovered that Albert was starting to generalize his fear response to anything fluffy or white or both. Now, the most unfortunate part of this experiment is that little Albert was not desensitized to this fear. He actually left the hospital before Watson could do so. Now, even though Watson did eventually try to go back and find Albert to fix and finish the experiment, Albert actually died at about the age of 6 due to an unrelated illness. So, the experiment was actually gone unfinished, so though it is deemed unethical just due to the fact of the subject that it used, it, however, is still an unfinished and has, to my knowledge, not been replicated in modern-day times. Our next psychological blunder is not one for the animal lovers out there. This is the learned helplessness experiment, and it was done in 1965 by psychologists Mark Seligman and Steve Meijer. This is conducted an experiment in which 3 groups of dogs were placed in harnesses. Dogs from each group were released after a certain amount of time with no harm done. Dogs from group 2 were paired up and leashed together, and 1 from each pair was given electrical shocks that could be ended by pressing of a lever. The dogs from group 3 were also paired up and leashed together, 1 receiving shocks, but the shocks did not end when the lever was pressed. The shocks came randomly and seemed inevitable, which caused a learned helplessness. The dogs assuming that nothing could be done about the shocks. Now, the dogs in group 3 ended up displaying symptoms of clinical depression. Later, dogs from group 3 were then placed in a box by themselves, basically. They were again shocked, but they could easily end the shocks by simply jumping out of the box. These dogs simply gave up, and again, displaying learned helplessness. Now, the image I have in the video is actually of a healthy pet dog in a science lab and was not an animal used in the experimentations, I assure you. Now, number 3, I believe, is actually a very notorious psychological study, and it goes by 2 names. It is called both the Milgram study, but it has also been called the obedience study. Now, this was actually a very controversial study even at the time, and it's one of the most well-known. In ways why it was even controversial at the time was because it was designed to see if people were actually just told what to do and they would just do it due to authority figure telling them this, or was it because they were innately capable of doing such things. Now, this actually occurred right after World War II, with all the Nazi atrocities that occurred at that time. And that is what made it the most controversial. Now, the Milgram study is not only one of the most notorious psychological experiments, it's also one of the most well-known, done by Stanley Milgram, a social psychologist at Yale University. He wanted to test the obedience to authority, so he set up an experiment with teachers who were actual participants and a learner who was an actor. Now, both the teacher and the learner were told that the study was about memory and learning, but the learner and the teacher received slips that they were told were given randomly when in fact they had both been given the slip that read teacher. The actor claimed to have received a learner slip so that the teacher was deceived. Both were separated into separate rooms so they could only hear each other. The teacher read a pair of words, following by 4 possible answers to the question. If the learner was incorrect with his answer or her answer, the teacher was to administer a shock with a voltage that increased with every wrong answer. If correct, there would be no shock, and the teacher would advance to the next question. Now, in reality, no one was actually being shocked. A tape recorder with pre-recorded screams was actually hooked up to play each time the teacher administered a shock. When the shocks got to a higher voltage, the actor or learner would then bang on the wall and ask the teacher to stop. Eventually, all screams and banging would stop and silence would ensue. This was the point when many of the teachers exhibited extreme distress and would ask to stop the experiment. Some questioned the experiment, but many were encouraged to go on and told that they would not be held responsible for any results. Now, if at any time the subject indicated his desire to halt the experiment, he was told by the experimenter to please continue, that the experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice, you must go on. Now, after all 4 orders, the teacher still wished to stop the experiment, it was then ended. Only 14 out of the 40 teachers actually halted the experiment before administering a 450-volt shock. Though every participant questioned the experiment, and no teacher firmly refused to stop the shocks after 300 volts. Now, keep in mind that the human skin is actually a very good insulator, and it's also a very good, it can keep in a lot of electricity. Unless you have any wounds or cuts, it's usually safe, quote unquote, to be shocked anywhere up to 50 volts. But if you apply voltage to bodily fluids, it's another story. Bodily fluids are very good conductors. In particular, blood is a very good conductor. So truly, any voltage can be dangerous. So anything really over 60 volts could potentially kill a human being. Now, that being said, the experiment went up to 450 volts. What was very interesting is that the voltage went up by increments of 15, which is odd, as usually increments usually go up by 10 or in 5s to have a more rounded or even looking number. Now, the last 3 volts indicated were actually very interesting as well, as they were not given numbers, but instead were replaced by a very ominous looking X symbol. Now, in 1981, Tom Peters and Robert H. Waterman Jr. wrote that the Milgram experiment and the later Stanford prison experiments were frightening in their implications about the dangers lurking in human nature's darker side. Now, they were not wrong. However, the Milgram experiment is thought to be somewhat of a failure because there was a little bit of discrepancy between at what point the teachers truly wanted to stop, because some of the times that they would not be allowed to stop. So it's also never been replicated. So that does add a little bit more controversy and a little bit less weight to the entire experiment within itself. Number 2 on our list is known only as the Well of Despair. Now, this occurred in 1960. This is also one of, I won't say favorite, but it's one of the more unnecessary and gorier aspects, and I will even allow you all to skip this one if you do not wish to hear about it. This was done by Dr. Harry Howlow, who was a very unsympathetic person after the death of his wife, according to certain sources, and would use terms such as rape rack and Iron Maiden in his experiments, not to be confused with the band Iron Maiden. Now, Dr. Harry Howlow was at first a very well-known and very highly respected psychologist in his field until this experiment occurred. Now, when he would use terms like rape rack and so on and so forth, he was actually speaking about certain tools that he would use in this particular experiment. He is most well known for the experiments that he conducted on rhesus monkeys, which concerned social isolation. Now, Dr. Howlow took these infant monkeys who had already been bonded with their mothers and then placed them in a stainless steel vertical chamber device and allowed no contact with anything else in order to sever those bonds. Now, they were kept in these chambers for up to a year. Now, it actually was in small increments. It was, one group was isolated for a few weeks, another group was for a few months, and then it got up to years. It was 3 months and then 6 months, in two separate groups. Now, the ones that were kept on only for a few weeks actually were able to pretty much reintroduce themselves into the monkey society with little to no issues. Those, however, who were kept for longer periods of time had a little bit more trouble, but the ones that they were kept away for up to 1 year, many of these monkeys came out of the chamber psychotic and did not recover. Now, Dr. Howell concluded that even a happy, normal childhood was no defense against depression, while science writer Deborah Blum called these common sense results, and in fact, they are very common sense results. Now, Gene Sackett of the University of Washington in Seattle, one of Howell's doctoral students, states that he believes that the animal liberation movement in the U.S. was born as a result of Howell's experiments. Now, there's also actually another part to this experiment as well. You see, Dr. Harry Howlow also had the theory that an infant would only cling and bond with its mother because it was a source of food. Now, the other part of the experiment that I was just speaking of actually occurred in the 1950s, and it was conducted on maternal deprivation in the monkeys. Now, these landmarks were not only an ethical huge hit to the psychological community, it was also very, very disturbing considering all that was going on. Now, the involving science of attachment and loss were basically around the time that Dr. Howell actually just lost his wife. Now, Howell himself repeatedly compared his experimental subjects to children, and press reports universally treated his finding as major statements about love and development of human beings when truly they were anything but. You see, he would actually have a rhesus monkey bond with two different mothers. One of the mothers was basically just for warmth, and it was covered in a towel, and it had the face of a monkey, but it would not be able to make eye contact, obviously, because it was fake. Now, the other mother was a source of food, and it was just a cold metal mesh rack with a bottle and something resembling a face. It was later found out that the monkey, when frightened by a machine that Harrell had actually created to just make noise and basically just terrorize the monkey, this was actually the entirety of the experiment to see which one the monkey would run to, and every time the monkey would actually go to the cloth-covered mother for comfort, thus kind of destroying his entire theory altogether. The other rather interesting part of this particular experiment is the fact that it later went on into the well of despair, and in fact, the monkeys, once grown, were actually, the females, would actually grow to be very aggressive and very uninterested in mating or even reproducing. So that is where the quote-unquote rape rack came in, where they would be artificially inseminated. Now, upon giving birth, the female monkeys would actually then turn on their offspring, killing them, one even tearing off their fingers, and another even, biting off their hands and then leaving them to die. The males, on the other hand, grew very antisocial, but also very shy, and to another extent, not feminine per se, but very complacent. They would not interact with other monkeys. They had no interest in mating or even socializing as well. This really actually was a huge, huge breakthrough, not in the sense that Dr. Howell was probably hoping, but in the fact of ethical terminology as to what would be acceptable for animal rights, and so on and so forth. This is actually all that has shaped the animal rights movement in the United States because of this experiment. Our last and final psychological blunder for the ages is one that is possibly the worst of them all. David Rimmer, this is from 1965 to 2004. Now, in 1965, a baby boy was born in Canada and was named David. At 8 months old, he was brought in for a standard procedure, a circumcision. I would like to make note that about 13% of all circumcisions are actually botched, so this is not as uncommon as one would like to hope. Now, unfortunately, during the process, a part of his genitalia was burned off. This was due to the physicians using an electrocutory needle instead of the standard scalpel. When the parents visited the psychologist John Money, very aptly named if you ask me, he suggested a very simple but controversial solution to a very complex problem. He opted for a sex change. I personally started reliving some of the aversion experimentations when reading that aspect, I'll not lie. Now, his parents were, however, very distraught by the situation, but they eventually agreed with the procedure. They didn't know that the doctor's true intentions were to prove that nurture, not nature, determined gender identity. And for his own selfish gain, he decided to use David as his own private case study. Now, David, now named Brenda, had a reconstructed female genitalia and was given hormonal supplements. Dr. Money called the experiment a success, neglecting to report all the negative effects of Brenda's surgery. Though she acted very much like the stereotypical boy and had conflicting and confusing feelings about an array of topics, worst of all, her parents did not inform her of the horrific accident that occurred as an infant. This caused a devastating tremor through the family. Brenda's mother was suicidal, her father became an alcoholic, and her brother became severely depressed. Now, finally, Brenda's parents gave her the news of her true gender when she was about 14 years old. Brenda then decided to become David again and stopped taking the estrogen and had the sex change reversed. Dr. Money, for some reason, reported no further results beyond insisting that the experiment had been a success, leaving out many details of David's obvious struggle with gender identity. Now, there is much more to this particular study as well. You see, Money was rather obsessed with the theory of gender neutrality, that gender identity development was primary result of social learning from early childhood, and that it could be changed with appropriate behavioral intentions. However, I use the term appropriate behavioral interventions very loosely with Money as to why he is not blacklisted in psychology is beyond me. Anyway, Money and physicians working with young children born with intersex conditions believed that the male genitalia could not be replaced with a functioning female genitalia, but it could be constructed surgically. It was also the safest and most conventional pathway to take. Now, Money told the parents that what was to be done was best for the boy. This was a lie. Money also claimed that David would be more likely to achieve successful functional sexual maturation as a girl rather than a boy. This was also a lie. Money on this case actually had a son of identical twins. David and his brother were both identical twins, and Money believed that where one could be raised as a boy, the other could be raised as a girl, for a perfect test of a control group and an experimental group. Now, Money actually persuaded the parents about the sexual reassignment surgery would be for the child's best interest. It was, in fact, not. And this actually occurred at the age of 22 months when this boy actually underwent the sex change. Now, what was the worst part was the fact that both boys actually received psychological support for the reassignment surgery. Not the fact that they were provided with therapy, but they were provided with therapy by John Money, which is a huge bias, as most of you would probably be able to assume for yourself. Now, they both continued to see Dr. Money for decades for the consultations to assess the outcome. This is where things got weird. First, Remmer's identical twin brother made the ideal control because the brothers both shared genes, family environments, and everything else. The second was reputed to be the first reassignment and reconstruction performed on a male infant who had no abnormality or prenatal or early on postnatal sexual differentiation. Now, it was later reported by the boys that Money actually forced the twins to rehearse sexual acts involving thrusting movements, with David, or Brenda, playing the bottom role and his brother playing the top. Now, David also said that as a child he had to get down on all fours with his brother Brian up behind his rear end and with his genitalia up against his buttocks. Now, David also claims that Money forced them into other sexual positions with his legs spread with his brother on top. Now, Money also has been accused of forcing the children to take their clothes off and engage in genital inspections. On at least one occasion, Money actually took photographs of the children doing these activities. Now, Money's rationale for these various treatments was his belief that childhood sexual rehearsal play was important for a healthy adult gender identity. This is a bald-faced lie if I ever saw one, as it is clearly child pornography in today's day and age. Now, for several years, Money did report that the John Jones case, as he called it, was a success, but it was not. His words were, "The child's behavior is so clearly that of an active little girl and so different from the boyish ways of her twin brother. This was a bald-faced lie." And even in the follow-up visits, which only occurred once a year, the boy's parents were routinely lied to the staff about the success about the procedure. They were told and forced to lie to the staff. Now, the twin brother of David actually later developed schizophrenia. And David, after many years of bullying and being called a cave woman and other horrific things that I will not go into because even I'm uncomfortable with repeating them. In addition to the difficult lifelong relationship with his parents and the basic void that it caused between them, David had to then deal with unemployment and the death of his brother, and his brother had actually died of an overdose of antidepressants. And then after a divorce from David, on the morning of May 4th, which is actually today in 2004, David actually committed suicide by shooting himself with a sawed-off shotgun at the age of 38. Now, this does hold some political relevancy to today, I will admit, and I don't like to get political on this channel, but this, of all things, truly does show that gender identity is not a social construct. This study alone proves beyond reasonable doubt that it is, in fact, nature, not nurture. And that is all the time I have for you today, my lovelies. I do so hope you enjoyed this video. And as always, remember, blessed be and stay classy.